Hi there and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Vincent DiGirolamo, the author of Crying the News, a history of America's newsboys. He's a professor at Baruch College in New York City. He's a former newspaper reporter, documentary maker, and young adult novelist. Welcome to the show, Dr. DiGirolamo.
Thank you, Evan.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Extra, read all about it. You probably have an image of a young fellow with smudges on his face, inky hands, waving newspaper at people walking by, doing whatever they can to sell newspapers. And you might think to move America forward. And you're not necessarily wrong. But what Dr. DiGirolamo argues is that the story of America can be told through its newsboys and how our news is delivered to us. So, Professor, why did we need a whole book to understand who those boys were, and were they mostly boys, by the way, and why they had to sell newspapers in the way that they did?
Okay, why newsboys? I mean, that's the essential question. One simple answer is that I didn't think there was a book that did that. I didn't think there was David Nassau. There was some chapter length and people looking at newsboys. There was the great literature of Horatio Alger and the pulling oneself up by the bootstraps image of newsboys. So they were kind of these cliched figures, if you will. I felt that we could look at newsboys, and it would be sort of a history of newsboys would be the history of the working class writ small, right? First of all, it was the most common form of boy labor next to farm work, from the 1830s onward. So we're talking about the majority of kids, urban kids, as well as small town kids as well, engaged in this kind of work. The newspaper industry had kind of shaped the story, and all the presidents were newsboys, and this is the way to learn good values to build your character. And so that sort of story narrative dominated. And I thought, sort of going into graduate school, discovering the history of childhood, coming into graduate school as a labor journalist and in the history of labor, I thought that the newsboys would be an interesting topic to look at child labor, the role these children played in their family economies, the role they played in the newspaper industry, and in shaping our ideas about capitalism, character, and upward mobility, and all of these things. So I thought they would be a vehicle in which I could get at a lot of different topics.
How and when did you decide that these kids had been given the short shaft when it comes to America's entire story? And why did they get that short shaft? Why was there so little literature written about them?
Well, first of all, I think children, like women, like African Americans, like working people, like illiterate immigrants and sharecroppers, they weren't considered to be people who made history, who had interesting stories to tell, right? History happened to them. And so, of course, I am inspired by the new social history of the 1960s and 70s, labor historian Herbert Gutman, trying to look at the history of the articulate, inarticulate, so-called inarticulate, and try to read the sources and get their voices. I had been very much inspired by this kind of history from the bottom up, and I thought that children were a relatively untapped source of information and their perspectives about how they saw the world, how they experienced the world. And so I wanted to get their voices and their perspective into the story.
How did the first news, and let's go back to the beginning, how did the first newspapers in America work? Who was printing them? Where were they being printed? And how did they get them to readers?
Well, this goes back to the colonial era, before the revolution, and there were newspapers that were founded in the colonies, Boston, New York, early newspapers, and they were primarily distributed through the mail. You also had postwriters, adults, and some young people who would distribute them. You had subscribers creating kinds of cooperatives in which somebody would take responsibility for circulating. So the post was the number one means, and people would just go to the shop. And then also you had, and this goes back to the Benjamin Franklin kind of a myth, the founding newsboy, the founding editor and publisher and sort of patron saint of journalists, Benjamin Franklin. He distributed, as an apprentice, he distributed his brother's newspaper. And so apprentices, printers' devils, who would help in the shop and try to learn the trade, they would also be tasked with distributing papers, not usually crying them, hawking them, but just delivering them to subscribers. In terms of the first one, Benjamin Franklin, of course, is always considered the first one in the 1720s. But I did come across a New York newspaper in the New York Historical Society, which says, Bradford's slave gave me this paper. Bradford's Negro gave me this paper. And so in some ways, I have shown that this news selling was kind of an entrepreneurial thing. It was a thing, an activity engaged in by apprentices. It was also slaves in this early period, and also in the 1840s and 50s, slaves were hired to actually distribute paper. So all these various labor systems are called into service for this work.
One really interesting point that the book makes is that in some cases, certainly maybe depending on when we're talking about, what period in American history we're talking about, but one really interesting thing is that the newsboys themselves couldn't necessarily read what they were selling. Who were the newsboys?
Well, the newsboys were the lower working class. They were native born, but also new immigrants, Irish, German. Irish dominated sort of in the early 1830s, 40s in New York. And they were the children of manual laborers for the most part, teamsters and sometimes saloon operators, later on policemen. So they were children of the working class, immigrant working class. Literacy rates in the United States were quite high compared to Europe and other countries, but there were children who couldn't read, and we see printers teaching them how to read. We see also newspapers open their own schools in the later 19th century, and we also see. I remember reading about a memoir. He said, you could not tease someone who couldn't read. That was crossing the line. You could tease him about his big nose. You could tease him about anything. But if you tease somebody about about not being able to read, you'd lose your friends. So there were some illiterate children, but children also talked about they learned to read through the papers that they carried, especially the immigrants. The first words I learned were Times, Journal, and calling the headlines, not knowing anything about what the contents of those papers were. So it's part of the history of literacy is the newsboys and the newspapers. What
was their day like? Let's if you could take me on a journey with them, if you could take me on if I could watch them, if I could shadow them for a day, what was the deal they had with publishers in terms of how many papers they had to sell? What techniques did they use to sell newspapers? And I would imagine that their alarm clock, if they existed back then, went off very, very early in the morning.
Yes. Well, the answer to this shifts over the decades, and I try to show how the industry changed, how transportation technology changed, all of which affected the way newspapers were distributed. So the answer is different from each period, but there is a lot of continuity. And to answer the first question, yes, there were girls. They were usually a minority of the population, but they were there. First reference into the 1850s. And some girls would dress as boys to avoid problems and conflicts and what have you. So what did their day look like? And of course, most of these children lived at home and worked as part of this family enterprise. But there were homeless children as well, particularly in the 1850s, 1870s, 1890s, these periods of economic panic. This was a means of subsistence living for children and adults during these hard times. So, you talk about getting up in the morning. There were two breeds of newsboys, those who got up in the morning and maybe mainly delivered to subscribers, and those who worked later and even to late into the night who hawked on the streets. And many boys did both. Many children did both of those things. But in terms of getting up in the morning, I think the cheap alarm clocks were first invented in the 1880s. They were widely available. But before that, children would have to rely on a parent to wake them up. One boy captured a sparrow, put it by his window, and when the sparrow would cheep, he would
smart.
get up. Yeah, and what else? So drink a lot of water at night, so you have to you wake yourself up. So there were tricks of the trade, and they would double. Talk about the diverse labor. They would be we call knocker boys, and that not only would they deliver the paper, they'd knock on the subscriber's door in the morning to wake him up or her up. So alarm clock, yes, part of the technology of newsboys. Mainly in the early days, you'd have to go to the newspaper. So children would, and if you were homeless, you would sleep in the alleys. You would sleep in the newspaper office themselves, under the tables, in mailbags, places like that. And newspapers thought they were doing a humane service by providing a place for these homeless people to sleep, but also, making them make sure that they were on hand, because if you had a newspaper and an issue and nobody to distribute it, you weren't going to sell many copies. So you could wake up, in a barrel on a hogshead, by the waterfront, go to the newspaper office, look at the headlines, see what the news was, see if you wanted 10 copies, 20 copies, 30 copies. You would pool your money. Sometimes you could get credit from a newspaper if you didn't have the ready cash, or from a distributor. There were middlemen and middle boys who sort of commandeered the labor of their pals. And then you had your turf and your most productive places. What I found interesting is that there was this whole underground economy, underground real estate economy. They bought and sold corners, streets, in front of this building, in front of that building. And in some cases, Philadelphia, the newspapers tried to control this, but in other places, it was just among the dealers themselves. And so you would go to your turf and you would sell there. You would protect it from other interlopers if that was happening at that moment, and you would approach people and with your cry. Many of these kids had distinctive cries, and
why did you call it crying the news?
I called it crying the news because I just thought it was a little double entendre in the sense there's a certain tragic element to the story, but mainly I wanted to call attention to this human form of distribution, in which you're actually not just filling the market, you're creating the market, you're creating the desire to buy with your cries. And the cries were sometimes, as I point out, exaggerated headlines, out and out false headlines, or whatever the kids thought would be the most attractive story of the day. So I wanted to get into the oral dimension of the city, the soundscape of the city, and newsboys' cries, like with other vendors and street hawkers and vehicles, they were part of the sound of the city. And so that's an aspect that I try to develop in the book as well.
Before I ask the question about whether these kids were part journalists too, because certainly this is their work crossed into the aspect of interpreting the news and how they could sell newspapers. But I want to ask, before I ask that, where did the first newsboys work? I imagine their work was more effective in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, as opposed to, say, Broome County, New York, with all due respect to our listeners there.
Well, New York City is the sort of birthplace of the penny press. And so that is where the first sort of prototypical newsboys worked. Barney, Flaherty, I have their names. The New York Sun, of course, comes out in 1833, and it cost a penny. So this is as opposed to the 6-cent blanket sheets, which really were just appealed to the merchant class and had merchant news. But the first pennies that tried to attract a working class audience, wide audience, were these penny newspapers. And so New York, Lower Manhattan, the waterfront, this was the birthplace of the news trade, if you will. In this way, it travels to Baltimore, Philadelphia right away, but then also in the early days, Springfield, Massachusetts, these places that you think are not metropolitan centers, also had newspapers and also would employ boys and the New York papers. These kids would get on the ferries and they would go up to Albany, they would go to Schenectady, they would go to Philadelphia and other cities, and so there was quite a wide distribution of newspapers from New York.
What was it about the news that made it perfect for a remote salesman? What kinds of stories sold best? And I'll jog your memory a little bit here. Your book opens with newsboys reporting on the Revolutionary War, then on the Civil War, then on the Spanish-American War, and then a boxing match, which is kind of the same thing. Were newsboys onto something that cable news has learned very well, that journalism sells best when it's conflict-oriented?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we have political conflicts, and we have local conflicts, sports. So newsboys really had their own kind of news sense. And I remember, sometimes it would be a congressional act, a law passed, but they would have a story about a two-headed calf that was born, and so they would go with the sensational. Newspapers, of course, the publishers, they had a great appreciation of the sensational. The Helen Jewett murder trial, prostitute murdered in New York in the 1830s, and so this became a huge seller, and newsboys were part of that. Also, we have in the early days, we have these hoaxes, right? Whether it's the moon hoax, a scientist discovers life on the moon, these naked bat-like creatures live in caves, fornicate in public, complete fabrication. Newsboys would run with that. And what was interesting is that the newspaper wouldn't be discredited and lose all credibility after that. It would that's part of the bamboozlement of the age. So that was part of it. And then that story would be on Broadway, would be in a play, and so they were part of the popular culture as well.
I think it's important to remember when it comes to journalism, the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then even into the 1900s, the journalism was essentially terrible. I mean, the journalism was very yellow, and the journalism was very sensationalized. And, we need to not look back on those times as if there was a Chet Huntley or something like that. And, we can debate the 1950s and 60s, but certainly, the journalism of the day was very partisan, even more so than it is now. And so I just think it's important that we put in context the type of news that these kids were selling. When does the business hit its heyday? When is the business both most efficient and lucrative for the newsboys, and also in terms of getting information to the public?
I use that word heydays in my chapter, Yelling the Yellows, in the 1890s. And here we have mass circulation, right? We have some of the Hearst and Pulitzer papers with their various editions. They're selling 1 million copies a day. 1 million copies a day in some cases. And this is, you sell 1 million pencils a day, whatever. That is a lot.
1 million of anything is a lot.
1 million of anything is a lot. So to me, that was the heyday. You also, of course, had the big influx of Southern and Eastern European immigrants beginning in the 1880s and 1890s. So the streets, boiled over with children. There was all kinds of labor power there available for them to use. We had department stores, and advertising took off in a big way. And again, the papers were 1-2 cents. They were cheap. And so, people talk about, social media, now people in the old days, they don't know what it was like. But, these newspapers were a kind of social media in the sense that they were pervasive and part of the culture and visual. and lucrative. Right, the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs, they were the Hearst, the Pulitzers, the media moguls of those periods were the political power movers of their day.
How does how do the Newsboys do? How much money do they make? Do they does it start to be a lucrative business for them? I mean, when you say they made a lot of money, that's all relative to how much probably the publisher is making. So how does the story of labor start to get intertwined with the story of the Newsboys themselves?
It really starts quite early in that the Newsboys sort of identify themselves as part. I mean, they are children of working people, and so as their older brothers and fathers start to organize, they organize as well, and they adopt the language. In the 1840s is the first strike, and they have grievances committees and indignation parades, and they engage in this kind of activity that they see other workers engage in. And so this continues in the 1850s and 60s. There's a strike in the 60s among newsboys who deliver to the soldiers, and the officers call it a mutiny, and they send the boys right out of the front lines. So there's and then post Civil War, the Gilded Age, and the rise of the Knights of Labor and all that. The children are part and parcel of that. There are the Young Knights of Labor. They're part of the AFL. They get in some cases they get charters. They're part of the Industrial Workers of the World in the early 1900s. So they're striking, they're protesting, they're demanding a better cut, a better ratio of the profits. They're protesting work rules. They're doing all of these things, and it's a real boom or bust sort of situation for them.
Do they make it?
Yeah.
Oh, so do they make enough money to live decent lives?
I don't know about decent lives, but when the founders of the newsboy lodging houses, first in the 1850s, 53, they talk about, well, they need about 80 cents a day, and they can make this, and so I have different figures in different periods, and it's 6 cents for them to stay at the lodging house, and they get meals they can get at these cheap refractories or street carts, the equivalent of street carts, and so. So some are able to recruit other boys, and there is big money to be made in newspaper distribution. The American News Company, which was the equivalent of Standard Oil in terms of its octopus-type reach over the trade, they could make or break a publication by refusing to distribute it or not. And so some of these were actually newsboys who started out, and then were able to found newspaper distribution agencies. So I call that the tiers of the trade, and looking at the subsistence living, which was quite common, a little more, spending money, and then those who made millions, and lots of turnover. Lots of people just decided there's no money in this, and they just got out of it.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Do we know the names of newspapers that use Newsboys? Are they still around? Times, Daily News, New York Post, Philadelphia Inquirer?
Yes, all of those use Newsboys. Everyone use Newsboys. A few at the very beginning said, "No, we can't disgrace ourselves with that kind of pandering and groveling but they quickly caught on. And same with the yellow journalists. The other people started to jazz up their stories and to make newspaper distribution not just this haphazard thing which the man in the basement sort of doled them out and took care of it. circulation management really started as a profession in the Midwest, in the papers of Chicago, Detroit, Cincinnati, Cleveland.
And how many would be on the street in a given day? Let's just take New York, because it's a city that I know and a city that a lot of people know. How many would be out there in a day? And I would assume they would be competing against each other to sell their own newspapers, to sell the newspapers that they work for, and then also to claim territory, and then also to find the areas in all the 5 boroughs where people are likely to buy news, bus stops, ferries, subway stops, things like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Circulation figures are often sort of exaggerated, but I do have it from their reports, from reformers' reports, from municipal authorities who are counting newsboys, and of course realize they're difficult to count. But in the various periods, you have New York, Philadelphia, we have 300, we have 500, and in the 1890s. We have 10,000 in New York City. No, we have 20,000, and so the numbers are not completely reliable, but they do show Buffalo 700. Sometimes small towns. You think it's a small town, they have 1,200 they count. Again, it's casual labor. Some people do it regularly. Some people do it only when the headlines are big. So it's a little hard to be precise about it, but they do, in the progressive era, they do hand counts. People go around and they interview and count the number of kids. So we are talking hundreds and then thousands in medium-sized cities and large cities.
So at what point do they start their decline? There are very few newsboys in most American cities today. I don't spend a whole lot of time in places like New York, Philly, or Chicago, or Boston. But when do we start to see drop-offs? What do newsboys have to start competing against? And I'm just going to throw a few things out there. You can certainly correct me. Is it radio? Is it TV? Is it more efficient transportation? What starts their decline?
I would say that the decline of the newsboy starts maybe in the 30s. There's still plenty of kids on the street in the 30s, but there's adults on the streets. Right? Instead of selling apples, you're selling newspapers. So it becomes competitive there. And then in the 1940s as well, World War II, you start to get, there's still kids on the street, but stands and newsstands sell a larger number of newspapers. You do get competition, radio, which gives people the spot news, and that's in the 30s and 40s, but it starts to take a little effect in the 40s. Child labor laws, I find that that didn't really reduce it. Early 1900s, 1910s, you get the first child labor laws, but they're applied mainly to other industries. Textile mills and mines and things like that. So as children are being pushed out of those occupations, they go into the streets, which are relatively unregulated because you're not really technically an employee as a newsboy. You just go buy papers and sell them. And so the newspapers say, well, they're not employees. Those laws don't apply to us. So they're still increasing even in the 1920s, 1930s. And then as I guess the industry changes in terms of it gets more rationalized. There's still kids up until the 1950s, 60s, again, mainly as carrier boys, delivering routes. Many of your listeners were newsboys. My friends, distributed newspapers, had paper routes when they were kids. But this starts to die off in the 70s and 80s because newspapers as a whole are suffering from lack of circulation, lack of readership, competition from the internet, things like that, not to mention there's some high-profile kidnappings, and there's other fast food, there's other ways. So children are really, some newspapers just, cut them off in the 80s, and we're only doing adult labor, and their adults in some ways are more efficient. They have their own cars, they absorb the insurance and the costs. And so children, we see them really, out of the hawking in sort of the 40s, and then out of the actual distribution and delivery in the 80s.
When I was growing up, there were occasional newsboys. I grew up in the Bronx, but I walked to the subway every day to go to high school. And I remember I believe it was the summer of 2004, a very smart newswoman. She was, she was probably a middle-aged woman who figured out that she could sell a bunch of newspapers. And so every morning I would get to the 238th Street stop, it's part of the elevated train. And so I would walk up 3 or 4 flights of stairs, and she'd be waiting at the bottom of them with 3 or 4 newspapers. And I never forget how she gave them to me. She would fold them up very neatly and kind of crisply so that I could put them under my arm or put them into the bag that I was carrying. At what point does our culture start to collide with this idea that I can just sit on the subway and read my newspaper, and when I get to work, I get to work?
When does it collide with that? Well, the commuter trade is the trade, starting in the first quarter of the 19th century. So they're providing this service. They're going on trains. In fact, railroad newsboys are a whole sort of subspecies where, cross transcontinental, there's boys who specialize selling on those trains. And then the streetcars and what have you, they're providing a big service. In fact, some of those early laws in New York, child labor laws, the judges throw them out. They're providing a service. I like to see a kid in the subway. I like to get my newspaper. And also, in some ways, the dealers, the subway newsstand, they don't want the kids there. So they're the ones who are trying to.
I was going to ask about newsstands. I was wondering, because they've got so many newspapers, and I certainly miss newsstands. Aren't they wonderful? And I would imagine they would be a significant competitor to one kid standing there with one newspaper, one brand of newspaper.
Oh yes, and they hired girls, young women to tend these stands, and these women struck as well, and the trade union leagues in New York would go to bat for them and demand that they had lunch breaks and what have you. So again, that's just the part of the tiers of the trade, the different kinds. But I think so. I'm not sure what you mean by colliding with the commuters, but these newsboys, these children and adults, they are really catering to this big traffic, and it's part of the rhythm of the city. I'll sell before school, when the commuters. I'll sell after school when the people are going home, and so that's part of the pulse of the city is these the commutes and the opportunity to sell.
No, you got it. That's a perfect answer. That's exactly what I was asking. I want to bust some myths too. Some of the myths about newsboys are created by movies, by popular culture. Some of them are created by Broadway. Many of us have seen the show Newsies. Then there's also Epcot. I live in Tampa. Epcot, when you go into the big round thing, there's one of the first sounds you hear is of a newsboy standing romantically on the street corner. The portrayal is that it was this romantic business, a business dominated by kids who saw themselves as loyal servants to American ingenuity. So is our perception of newsboys accurate?
Well, I try to show in the book that they are not so much little capitalists, future presidents, moguls of big companies, learning to trade in a way that will serve them well on Wall Street. That is a prevalent myth that's quite directly and intentionally manufactured. Yes, you can trace back certain presidents and certain multimillionaires and who will talk about their first job. So there is that sort of reality. But of course, when everybody is selling papers as a kid, all these working class kids, some are going to make it, in the entertainment world, in the business world, in the professions, and others are going to go to Sing Sing. And so that's the debate in the progressive era. And the newspapers are saying, look at all these successful people who are newsboys, and the reformers are saying, look at all the convicts who were newsboys.
Which presidents became newsboys? I'm sorry.
The other way around. Yeah.
Other way around. Which newsboys became president?
Hoover comes to mind. He was in the West. Herbert Hoover. Teddy Roosevelt said he did it. He was a rich kid, but he said he did it for a while.
I'm sure he was very loud and annoying when he was doing it.
Yeah. According to the Circulation Managers, International Circulation Managers Association, every newsboy since Lincoln, except 2 or 3, were newsboys, and so it's the exceptions that you would have to find. So this is the myth, but what's not part of the myth is that they're also labor leaders. They're also activists. They're also radicals, and most of them just become part of the working class, and they take other sort of adult jobs. So that's what I try to situate them in this, away from that myth and into this working class milieu in which they are hustling for work. And that, come to find out, wage labor is not the only form of labor that working people use to subsist, and that they're taking in boarders, they're giving lessons, they're making baked goods, they're doing all kinds of things in order to hustle. So this commerce aspect of being poor working class is as prevalent, was even more prevalent then than today, and it's still prevalent today.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that there are a number of ways in which this story echoes very loudly to today's society. Why is it important for us to understand that the kids who were hawking papers are an example of how big business found a way to exploit the little guy?
Well, yes, there is exploitation. What I say in my introduction, I try to be balanced, but that there's a thin line between exploitation and opportunity. So some of these children see this as an opportunity. They're bringing home money. They're putting coins in their mother's apron. That's buying milk and bread for that day. So that's a kind of an opportunity that they appreciate, that the newspaper publishers think that they're providing a good service. Not to mention giving them banquets, having sports teams, bands, all these other sort of philanthropic things they do for the kids, but just giving them work. But what is exploitation? Exploitation is use for profit. And so these newspapers are definitely using their labor for profit. And they say, oh, well, we're just doing a good service. But they fight, like heck to combat any laws regulating their ages or hours and things like that, and they sabotage others. The best way to wipe out a rival or a new paper is to commandeer the boys, give them free copies, and make sure that the other paper does not have this labor supply to help it. So that's happened a lot as well. So newspapers are profiting and utilizing and engaging in all kinds of scientific management practices and corporate welfare devices. They're really leading the other industries in these methods of management and supervision.
What mark did Newsboys leave on our society? In other words, if we look around at our society today, where do we see them still? I'll throw out a couple of things. Is it Twitter? Is it cable news? I mentioned that earlier. Is it just plain old entrepreneurial spirit?
Well, the legacy of the newsboy shows up in many ways. First of all, many cities have statues of newsboys, and they're also kind of serve a nostalgic, backward-looking role. But it is that free enterprise, the free press. They're symbols of this economic system, this system of communication, and so that legacy lives on. In terms of providing the function, yes, we have Twitter, we have other forms, not human face-to-face sort of transferal of information. But these children live on. I suppose. I mean, at one point, people will not. What was a newsboy? At one point, they might say, "What was a newspaper?" So the legacy might be diminishing. But for me, I think the legacy is that these children were part of the culture, were part of the labor system. We see also in novels, in genre paintings, in photography, whether it's Louis Hine or others, Jacob Riis, we see that this iconic figure is part of our history of communication, history of city life, history of labor in the United States. And so that's the story I want to tell, and I want other workers today, whether they're distributing papers, again, non-unionized, whether they're driving, taxi cabs, they're independent merchants, they're entrepreneurs, they're not employees. That's in some ways that's the legacy of these kids as well. The fact that they're not defined as employees and they're not entitled to labor rights, whether it's Social Security and what have you. And so in some ways that kind of labor system is still alive and well and growing. This what do you call
the gig economy?
Gig economy, exactly.
So I was going to ask, who are today's newsboys? Is there a parallel? I was thinking maybe it's Amazon workers because they go through and they take a product. Really, when you buy from Amazon, you're sort of buying Amazon. You're barely even buying the product anymore. Who are today's newsboys?
Well, the newspapers are still delivered, and they are delivered by adults. I mean, I went to a depot in Long Island, and I assisted my nephew, and I delivered for a week while he was on vacation. And they are like the newsboys of the past in that they are immigrants. There were many languages spoken in that depot, and some of them brought their children to help on weekends as well. So they are you don't need to be really hired. You go there, you have your route, you own your route, and you don't need to speak English. So in that sense, there's a lot of continuity. But there are also military veterans and retirees who can't really make it on their pensions or their Social Security. So they are the lower working class and the new immigrants today.
If you could build, and I've asked this question a few times in the show, but it just seems to work, and the authors we interview on here seem to like it. So I want to ask it to you. If you could build a memorial to newsboys, what would it look like? Where would it be? If there could be like a monument, a national memorial to the newsboy, where would you put it? What would it look like? How would you design it?
Well, that's a good question. There was one at the Smithsonian. It was a carving of Barney Williams, the first newsboy. That was his stage name, and that stood for years. So the Smithsonian is an interesting place to have a tribute. There are not a lot of working class or labor monuments throughout the country. I don't know, maybe Newspaper Row in New York to have a statue. And there were statues that were moved and removed. But you could also have a monument. I think, the monument to newsboys would probably be a scholarship for young, hungry workers and there were scholarships as well. These newsboy unions would have newsboy scholarships. They got into Harvard, they got into MIT. And so that's a legacy, and that Theodore White, the great journalist, he got a scholarship, and other people. So that's a way of sort of memorializing and sharing the wealth of newspapers and what have you. And so I would do a scholarship.
What do we lose in our society without having a youngster on every corner or on every other corner screaming out the news, crying the news, and trying to sell us a newspaper?
Well, what we lose things we want to lose. We lose children getting crippled, children getting mugged, children getting sexually abused. There is the reality, children not having opportunities to go to school or not exercising what limited opportunities they have. So there were
good things to lose.
There were good things to lose. But you also lose, I think, an autonomy, an early sense of being a contributor to society. Children knowing what's going on in the city before the adults do, and trading on that knowledge in various ways, not just selling the papers, but in terms of their conversation and their connections with other people. So there's not this artificial childhood youth where you're cut off from the world. These children are in the streets. They're in the newspaper office. They go into saloons. They go into the streetcars. Sometimes they go into brothels, but they're part and parcel of the adult culture and entertainment industry and what have you. And so I think that kind of childhood creates a kind of precociousness, a kind of savvy that is not bad. And we're talking about parents, my father, my uncle, they had that kind of upbringing. And they were wise.
I was just going to ask about them. The thing I miss the most about the Newsboy is the act of buying the newspaper. I like that transaction, the 2 quarters, plunking it down, the sound it makes. They put it into their thing. They hand you the newspaper, the sound, the feel, and then you feel like you're buying something important. You're buying a document that tells you what happened the day before. What a wonderful thing and wonderful experience that just simply, I don't want to say it doesn't exist anymore, but it is much less common and much more rare.
And another thing, you can feel the philanthropist yourself. If your news seller is an older woman, if it's a person with one leg, if it's a little ragged kid, you're doing something good for this ambitious, enterprising kid, as well as informing yourself. And so those interactions also had that element as well.
You dedicated the book to your family. You just mentioned them, Andrew and George, and the beginning of the book has a picture of them selling newspapers, I think, or maybe they're being harassed by a policeman or something like that. How did you find that picture? And had it been in your family for a long time, or did you come upon it while you were researching?
No, I could never locate it and see what newspaper it was from. It was either Somerville, Massachusetts, or Boston, and it was the clipping was in the family. One of my aunts had it, and it is a picture, 1931, I believe. They are 4 or 5 years old, and they're runaways, and they are running to California. My grandfather moved to California for the fishing, and the family sort of followed piecemeal. So they were running off to California, and the picture is of a detective interviewing them. So they got their little scared faces, and they're really tiny tots. But at that age, they were selling papers. They were giving money to their mother. Those two were 2 of 13 children, and so like a lot of immigrant families, their children worked, and so I grew up with their stories, and I wanted to use that picture as a kind of a tribute to them.
Vincent DiGirolamo, author of Crying the News, A History of America's Newsboys. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Certainly check out that book and his Twitter feed at VincentDiGirol3. His website is VincentDiGirolamo.com. There's going to be a link to both of those in our show notes if you want to click on them. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. How appropriate for a show on Newsboys. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.